Good afternoon, everybody. Well, welcome back. I hope that you guys enjoyed the break that we had a little bit around the exam as far as the study days. And for those of you that had my other sections that had a test review day to get us back on schedule because of Martin Luther King Day, it's kind of a nice break, I think, in between sections when we have an exam to kind of, like I said, on day one, have a little bit of a mental reprieve, have a couple of days, where you can kind of perform, excel on the test, which you guys did, and then take a little breather before we engage and start the next unit. So just as an introduction here, I want to clarify what I meant by my other sections. My section VO3 that I'm meeting with and recording this, I guess, quote unquote, live. Of course, it's a virtual meeting. This session is being recorded, just so you're all aware of that. This session is being recorded because tomorrow, my Thursday sections, I have 4 sections on Thursday that I teach, and I have the honor, I guess, to represent Midlands Technical College. I was selected kind of last minute-ish to head down. The South Carolina colleges have an annual meeting, and I was selected to go and represent the science and healthcare department at Midlands Tech and give a speech, a presentation down there on Thursday. So obviously that will preclude me from being able to give our lectures on Thursday. So I'm recording this lecture, and I'll be sharing it with my Thursday sections as well. For you guys today, section VO3 on Wednesday, nothing changes. Everybody, please remember, all of you listening, whether you're listening to this live or whether you're listening via Zoom because you're a Thursday section, make sure to send me your extra credit / attendance verification questions. Then I can award you the extra credit point and prove that you watched the video to meet the attendance requirements of the college, okay? Again, for my Wednesday group, you'll get your normal response today. They'll get entered. Thursday group, don't expect to hear anything back from me until probably Monday because I'm at that conference from Thursday all the way through Sunday, okay? So just wanted to give everybody a heads up, fair warning. This is being recorded and going to be shared with 4 different sections on Thursday as well as our Wednesday meeting today. So first thing, I want to recap for everybody. On exam number 1, you guys did an excellent job. Really, really, truly what I love to see from Bio 211. The very reason I love working with Bio 211. You guys are superstars. You've been through it. Like I said on day 1, you guys were the cream of the crop, quote unquote, in Bio 210, and you certainly backed that up. The vast majority of you backed that up tenfold on the first exam. I think it's also kind of a relief to students, at least the feedback from students in previous semesters is having that first semester or that first exam behind you. If you haven't had me for a previous lecture, now you really see exactly what I meant by the underlying content being the test questions and the test questions being underlying content. As you saw and know, I shared with you what the 3 matching questions were. So remember back on day 1, I said I'm going to do everything in my power to help you guys achieve the grade that you hope to in this course, okay? But I can only lead you to the water. I can't make you drink. So for some of you that didn't put in the study time, you know who you are. Obviously, there's lots of time left in the semester and plenty of opportunity to bring those grades back up. But the vast majority of you absolutely aced the test. Keep up the good work. For those of you that need to study a little harder, use it as a learning opportunity and let's finish strong for the rest of the semester. So, all right, moving toward exam number 2, unit 2, section 2, if you will, okay? And on our calendar, we can see that we have the next 3 lectures, this one included, are on the cardiovascular system. We're going to break it into 3 chunks. Cardiovascular anatomy today, talking more about the parts and the function of the heart itself. Then next week, we'll talk about cardiac physiology. How does it all work? What are the enzymes, the ions, contractions? How do we measure stroke volume and cardiac output and other things? So that one gets a little bit more in the weeds on it, a little bit more in depth. And then our third lecture on the cardiovascular system will be on cardiac vessels, both veins, arteries, and then also a little bit on capillaries as well. Okay, but primarily on veins and arteries. How do they work? Gas exchange, nutrient exchange, waste removal, etc. Okay, and then that'll take us to the last section of preparing for exam number 2, and that's going to be 2 lectures on the respiratory system. And we link purposefully the cardiovascular system and respiratory system together because they really do work hand in hand to bring oxygen into the body from the outside environment, load it onto those red blood cells, and then the heart and the cardiovascular system pump that oxygen along with other things, as we know, like hormones, for example, but nutrients and other things throughout the body to all of our cells and tissues and organs, and then along the way pick up waste and return them back. Ultimately, many of those waste products return to the lungs, and we exhale and put them back out dispose of them into the external environment. So the 2 systems are intricately linked in what they do for homeostasis and for tissue and cell and our own survival. Okay, as you guys know from first day introductions, cardiology is my specialty in medicine. So this is a system that is near and dear, pardon the pun, but to my heart. I love it. I knew very early on in med school I wanted to go into cardiology. I just absolutely loved it. One of the things that just mesmerized me, and for the guys that I had yesterday, the guys and gals, my section that I have lab for this semester, forgive me for repeating this, but where I really became hooked on the cardiovascular system was just the sheer amazement of the heart. And we think of, the heart is, of course, nothing more than a muscle, okay? A critical muscle, but a muscle. And it contracts continuously from when we're still inside of the placenta within our mother. Before we're even born, our heart is beating 24 hours a day, every second of every day, all the way through our lifetimes until the moment that we die. And that muscle never fatigues. And think about that for a second and compare it to all of the other muscles in the human body. We run for 2 miles or a mile, whatever it is. Some crazy people who, in my opinion, joking of course, run 27 miles for a marathon, but I could never do that. But anyway, muscles fatigue, right? The cardiovascular system and the heart in particular never, ever, ever gets a break, and yet performs perfectly for the vast majority of us and have taken care of for our entire lifetime. So it really is an amazing system, and the heart is an amazing organ. So today we are going to start with heart anatomy. This is going to be the first section. And guys, just know that this chapter is broken into 2 sections. We're going to have it. We're going to do heart anatomy today. And like I said, we'll do heart physiology next time. So that means that you're only going to have 2 extra credit questions / attendance questions that you'll be sending in to me. Okay. There's only going to be 2. This heart anatomy is very purposefully designed because there are a lot of parts. Okay. And knowing the function of the heart and blood flow through the heart and through the valves and through the exit arteries and into the return veins, etc. There's a lot to absorb just related to the heart and anatomy to begin with alone. So it certainly is intentional that we split it up and we double up what you're hearing over in lab when we talk about the heart anatomy and blood flow and valves, etc. Okay, it's very purposeful. If we only gave it to you once, it'd be a big struggle for students to possibly replicate it and do well on tests. Okay, so trust me, this is all designed so that you hear these things twice, slightly differently, so that it drives the information home so you can succeed and meet your goals academically on exam number 2 and on lab quiz number 2. Okay. From there, heart physiology next time will be all new. But so there's going to be a little bit of overlap to lab. All right. So the heart, at the end of the day, like I said, it is a muscle. The heart is a massive, powerful muscle that's divided into 4 different chambers. We're going to, of course, talk about those. And it is, at its essence, functionally a pump. Okay. We talked about the lymphatic system and how it's an open loop system, right? It only has those lymphatic vessels that had those finger-like projections, okay, and pulled lymph, extrastitial fluid out of the body and recycled it. The cardiovascular system is a closed loop system, and I use the analogy when we're talking about the lymphatic system of plumbing in our house, okay? Our plumbing system doesn't have openings where water just pours out, right? So the heart and the cardiovascular system, the arteries, veins, and capillaries, is a closed loop system. So the pump that is the heart, its contractions force blood through that closed loop of the arteries, then the capillaries, then the veins, and then returning ultimately to the heart, all because of pressure generated from the pumping action of the heart, okay? The adult heart beats somewhere between 60 to 70, 75 times a minute, depending on your age, your body size, and your physical conditioning. So the 75 times a minute is just a very general term. It really has a lot of different factors that figure into what an average is. But somewhere between 60 and 75 is about average at rest, okay? The 3 areas of blood, and most people really know about the 2 circulatory loops, okay? And we'll be talking more about these when we talk about cardiac vessels 3 lectures or 2 lectures after this one, okay? We have this systemic circulation, which takes oxygenated blood from the heart and pumps it all the way around to the entire body, to our fingers, to our toes, to every muscle, tissue, organ, our brain, everywhere in our body. Every cell needs oxygen. Every cell needs nutrients. Every cell produces waste, okay? So those erythrocytes, as we all know at this point, those red blood cells carry oxygen out to the cells along with other nutrients and enzymes and ions and hormones, but then also pick up waste, namely carbon dioxide, cellular byproduct of cellular activity, to recycle back to the heart, ultimately to the lungs, okay? So that's the systemic loop, if you will, okay? Heart all the way through the body, back to the heart, dropping off oxygen, picking up waste. That one's pretty common sense-ish. Everybody knew that long before you enrolled in this class. The pulmonary loop is also well known, but we really don't think about it as much. But that's where the heart, and we're going to talk about this today at length, where the heart pumps deoxygenated blood, returning to the heart, from the heart to the lungs, and then gas exchange occurs. That carbon dioxide waste is offloaded in the lungs. Red blood cells then reabsorb or attract or bond with oxygen molecules that we've inspired from the external environment within the lungs. And then part of that pulmonary loop then is then continuing away from the lungs back to the heart with oxygenated blood. So it's deoxygenated blood coming from the heart to the lungs for gas exchange, offload CO2, onload O2 oxygen, and then bring that freshly oxygenated blood back to the heart so it can start the loop back to the systemic circulation, take that oxygen throughout the body. All right, so those are the big 2. Right? But so what's the third one? And that's that, and this is an important concept that I learned very early in my cardiology training, is that, and we heard this early and often, and it really is very true. The heart is an exceptionally selfish organ, okay? It feeds itself first. It always feeds itself first, okay? So when oxygenated blood is leaving the heart, and we're going to see that's coming from the left ventricle in the next couple of slides, and it's full of oxygen and nutrients. The very first thing is the heart is going to have its own arteries and veins called coronary arteries and coronary veins, collectively called a coronary circulation, the third loop, if you will, of vessels. And the oxygen and nutrients are going to feed and nourish the muscles of the heart that keep it contracting. Because after all, like we've said, the heart is a muscle. It needs oxygen. It needs nutrients. It produces carbon dioxide and other wastes. Okay? So that's the third loop, feeding itself, coronary circulation, the one that a lot of people don't think about. By the way, that coronary circulatory loop, those arteries of the heart in particular, are the ones that become clogged with cholesterol from fatty foods that we eat over time and become blocked when you hear about somebody having a heart blockage, and then eventually that clots or narrows off because it's so blocked that blood can't flow through, and that is in fact what a heart attack is, when that coronary arteries become blocked and can't take oxygen and nutrients to a given section of the heart. And then that given section of the heart dies and people lose heart function. So all related to the three functions and the three circulatory loops of the heart. All right, so we saw this slide before, and I promised you guys that when we got to cardiology, we'd be talking about this slide again, back when we were talking about the lymphatic system, just as a comparison of the closed loop system of the circulatory system versus the open loop of the lymphatic system, okay? So from the heart, remember, leaving the heart, the largest in diameter of vessels, but fewest in number, are going to be arteries, and that starts, if we talk about the systemic loop, which we typically are, starts with the aorta, the largest artery in the body. But for the coronary loop and the pulmonary loop, there are others. Okay, the arteries then split. They divide into smaller in diameter, but more numerous arterioles, which then in turn split many, many, many times over into very tiny in diameter capillaries. And there are millions of capillaries in the body because ultimately capillaries have to come into contact with every single cell in the human body. So every single square centimeter of our skin and organs and tissues and muscles have to have contact with a capillary in order to bring nutrients and oxygen. So there are millions and millions of capillaries. And at the capillary level is where gas exchange occurs. This is where oxygen offloads from the erythrocytes, CO2 onloads, nutrients, all kinds of other things as well. But for the most part, when we're talking about the cardiovascular system and respiratory, we're going to talk time and again about oxygen being delivered to the cells and carbon dioxide being then unloaded to be removed from the body. Okay, from the capillaries. Then we're going to go in reverse order. We're going to get larger in diameter, but fewer of them, venules, which are the comparison of the arterioles. On the oxygenated side, this is now deoxygenated blood, full of CO2 heading back to the heart and ultimately to the lungs. The venules then cut their number down, but get wider in diameter as they become veins, and the veins eventually return back to the heart, dumping that deoxygenated blood so the heart can send that deoxygenated blood down the pulmonary circuit to head toward the lungs for gas exchange. Okay? So arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back too. Arterioles are smaller arteries. Venules are smaller veins. And know for the exam that capillaries are the smallest but most plentiful of our blood vessels. All right. So the myocardium, we're going to talk about the layers of the heart in a little while. The myocardium there's the epicardium. The myocardium is the inner, thickest middle layer. And then the endocardium is the innermost layer, okay? The myocardium is the muscular wall of the heart. This is cardiac muscle tissue that we learned about in Bio 210, okay? With the striated, with the discs that allow for electrical charging and synchronous contractions. okay? The myocardium is really what we think of when we think of the heart. The endocardium is just an inner smooth lining, so nothing adheres or sticks to it. And the epicardium is just the outer surface of the heart, more protective in nature. So the muscular wall is really the myocardium, and that's what's really doing the work of the heart in its pumping function, okay? So this is where oxygen and nutrients are needed, okay? So blood coming from the coronary arteries to the muscle of the heart, the myocardium, feeding itself first, okay? That blood coming from the coronary arteries that immediately left the heart with oxygen is highly oxygenated and has very little CO2 on board. And then the cardiac muscles of the myocardial tissue have low oxygen and high CO2 from contracting and doing their cellular work. Okay, so gas exchange occurs, the oxygen jumps off the erythrocytes, provides oxygen to the myocardial tissue, the CO2 then jumps onto the erythrocytes, and the blood becomes deoxygenated, returns to the heart, and makes its way back to the lungs to become reoxygenated. Okay, kind of the pathway of gas exchange when we're talking about nourishing and feeding the myocardium, the muscle of the heart itself, through the coronary circulatory loop. All right, so this slide says exactly the same thing. Oxygen-rich blood is coming to the heart, gas exchange occurs, and then oxygen-depleted blood, along with CO2 attached, returns to the heart. All right, here is an illustration of the systemic loop and the pulmonary loop, the two big ones that we talk about. We'll see the coronary circulation later, okay? Again, systemic is system-wide, hence the name systemic circuit, okay? These are the arteries taking oxygenated blood out to the body, eventually through a chain of different vessels on the arterial side, bringing oxygenated blood to capillaries where gas exchange occurs. We now have deoxygenated blood reabsorbed onto the erythrocytes within the capillaries. From the capillaries, that CO2-rich blood now without oxygen starts making its way back in the venous side, ultimately making its way back to the heart, okay? And this is where I'm going to talk for the first time and introduce the flow of blood through the heart, okay? All right, so let's talk about and start with the entry point of deoxygenated blood on the venous side coming back to the heart, okay? There's no oxygen. There's a load of CO2, waste product, attached to the erythrocytes at this stage. All right, so the deoxygenated blood is going to make its way back. Remember, I said there are 4 chambers of the heart, okay? There's a right side of the heart with 2 chambers and a left side of the heart with 2 chambers, okay? The top 2 chambers, right and left, are each called, as you can see, an atrium, or plural, the word is atria, okay? So we have 2 atria, a right and a left. Smaller chambers, much thinner muscle walls, and we'll explain why later. All right, underneath them, the bottom 2 chambers on the right and left-hand side are our ventricles, okay? We have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. These are the workhorse, true pumps of the heart, significantly thicker myocardial muscle tissue, okay? And we'll explain why later. All right, so deoxygenated blood returns primarily through the vena cava. And we're going to talk about cardiac vessels. You'll hear about these, a lot more coming up, but there's an inferior vena cava bringing deoxygenated blood from everywhere underneath the heart in the body, and then a superior vena cava from everywhere above the heart in the body, blood returning. And the vena cava, both superior and inferior, feed that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Okay, so this is the entry port, one of the 4 chambers that receives deoxygenated blood. Now, there's that third loop, coronary circulation. It isn't featured right here, but that is the third return port to the right atrium And that's called the coronary sinus, and that winds around the back and also brings that deoxygenated blood from the heart itself. Okay, so there's really three ports of deoxygenated blood returning to the heart: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus from the cardiac vessels. All right, from there, when the atria contract, both atria contract or squeeze at once. And what they're going to do when they contract is squeeze that blood through the valves that we're going to talk about downward from both of the atria down into the ventricles, which are open and waiting for that blood to be squeezed into them. Okay, so following our path, we have deoxygenated blood returning to the heart, to the right atrium. The atria then contract, they squeeze, the valves open, and the blood from the right atrium, that deoxygenated carbon dioxide rich blood, gets squeezed and pushed down into the right ventricle. The same thing's happening on the left-hand side, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so now we have the deoxygenated blood down in the right ventricle, right? So the atria, when they contract in synchronicity together, the ventricles are relaxed, open, waiting to receive the blood, okay? Then, when it's time for the ventricles, right and left, to contract, the atria are starting to fill back up, but blood doesn't go back from the ventricles into the atria, okay? That's what the valves are for. We don't want that to happen. That's called regurgitation. That's bad. We want the blood to go out in the direction we want it to flow. So from the right ventricle, following our pathway, remember this is deoxygenated blood. When the right ventricle contracts, it's going to push that deoxygenated blood up through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries. And this illustration isn't really good. There's one on the right and there's one on the left. It's going to go to the right and lung together. But the deoxygenated blood then makes its way via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Gas exchange occurs. CO2 is offloaded. Oxygen is onloaded. Makes its way back now via the pulmonary veins, coming back. Okay, and again, this illustration is oversimplified. There are 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right, 2 from the left, but they are all going to dump that oxygenated blood coming from the lungs into the left atrium. Okay, so the right atrium is the receiving chamber for deoxygenated blood from the body, and the left atrium is the receiving chamber for oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. All right, so you can think of the atria as receiving chambers, whereas the ventricles are pumping chambers. Okay, the right ventricle is going to pump that blood all the way to the lungs and back around this pulmonary loop. Okay, all right, the left ventricle then, well, from the left atrium, atrial contraction will occur again in synchronicity, and the valve will open. This time it's a mitral valve, and the blood will make its way from the left atrium down to the open and waiting left ventricle. The valve will seal shut, and now when the left ventricle contracts, the left ventricle is the biggest workhorse of the heart. Of all 4 chambers, by far the most muscular because, and it makes a lot of common sense, the left ventricle has to push blood with more force than anything else. It has to move blood all the way through the whole body. The atria, remember I said the walls are pretty thin? Well, they only have to push blood downward a couple of inches from the atria into their respective right and left ventricles, right? So they don't have to move blood far at all. And gravity is on their side, pulling that blood down. Okay, the right ventricle is going to be a little bit thicker of the myocardial muscular wall because it has to move blood further than the atria, but it only has to move blood a few feet to the lungs and back. Whereas the left ventricle has to be extremely muscular because it has to pump blood all the way out through the entire body, again, to our toes, fingers, top of our skull, and all the way back. So the left ventricle is the true workhorse okay? And when the left ventricle contracts, it pumps blood out the aorta to all of the other arteries in the body, and we start all over again, okay? So that is the flow of blood through the heart and through both the pulmonary and systemic loop. And the coronary arteries you can add in, that the very first thing that happens right here is the coronary arteries branch off, bringing oxygen to the heart muscles, and then the coronary veins wind around the back and dump deoxygenated blood right back into this right atrium. Okay, so that's how all three of the cardiac circuitry loops work. All right, so gas exchange in the lungs. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about the respiratory system in a few weeks. The alveoli are tiny, microscopic air sacs. They kind of look like bunches of grapes, okay, but they're microscopic. There are millions of alveoli wound up very tightly in our lungs. These are the little bulbs that come into contact with the capillaries of that pulmonary circulatory loop and where gas exchange occurs. When we inspire oxygen, they ultimately move through our bronchi and bronchioles to the alveoli. The alveoli, these little grape-like clusters, they contact with the capillaries, and that's where oxygen and CO2 are exchanged, okay? Again, you're going to hear a lot more about alveoli and how that all works and occurs when we get to respiratory system, okay? So again, within the pulmonary capillaries, the air within the alveoli is going to have a lot of oxygen because we've inhaled it and brought it into the alveoli. It's not going to have carbon dioxide, but the blood coming from the heart, from that right ventricle, going to the lungs for gas exchange is going to be full of carbon dioxide and low oxygen. And of course, at the alveoli and the capillaries within the lungs, that oxygen and CO2 exchange occurs, and ultimately the blood becomes reoxygenated and then comes back via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, freshly oxygenated. Okay? So pulmonary circulation, again, oxygen poor blood leaving the right ventricle, going to the lungs. CO2 is offloaded at the lungs. Oxygen is onloaded at the lungs onto the erythrocytes. That oxygen-rich blood now makes its way back to the left atrium of the heart. Okay, so a lot of times in cardiology, we talk about right heart and left heart disease. Okay, and the key differences are when we're talking about that or defining that is that if a patient has left heart disease, we're talking more about the oxygenated side, the left ventricle and the left atrium, versus the right heart where it's the deoxygenated side. Okay, you can imagine a patient, no one wants heart disease or myocarditis or something that diminishes the contractile forces of the heart itself. Okay, but if you're going to have it, it's better to have right heart disease because the ability of the heart to eject deoxygenated blood isn't quite as critical as the ability of the heart not being able to eject sufficiently oxygenated blood. All right, so gas exchange out of the system, we've talked about this before, okay? This is where, again, the heart ejects oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood from the left ventricle out through the body, through the arteries, ultimately to the capillaries. The oxygen at the capillary level, touching all of our cells, offloads oxygen, onloads CO2, carbon dioxide, and then the blood starts its way back. That deoxygenated but loaded with carbon dioxide waste starts its way back, returning to the heart in the venous side. So we've talked about that. So that's the systemic circulation. Oxygen-rich blood leaving the heart, gas exchange system-wide, oxygen-poor blood returning to the heart. All right, so we've talked about this before, and I just literally mentioned this, that sometimes the heart can be considered, while it often and most commonly is considered a 4-chamber pump, but really it is, in theory and in function, two side-by-side two-chamber pumps. The right side, again, is responsible for deoxygenated blood, receiving from the body and then pumping that deoxygenated blood to the lungs for gas exchange, whereas the left two chambers of the heart receive oxygenated blood from the lungs and then pump that oxygenated blood from the left ventricle out to the body. Okay? So two different functions if you want to bifurcate the heart into two side-by-side pumps, one responsible for deoxygenated blood, one responsible for oxygen-rich blood. All right, first of your two quiz questions today. Of these vessels that are listed that we've talked about, which one is the smallest in diameter? Also the most plentiful? For those of you that will be watching this on the Zoom, I'm going to give it a minute for my live class. Don't forget, those of you watching on Zoom, to email in your answers. Okay, continuing. All right, so back to the basics of cardiac anatomy. The heart, if you remember back to Bio 210, of course, the heart sits in, very generally, the thoracic cavity. Everything above the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity, but then more specifically is the mediastinum, this center little rectangular box that really encompasses really only the heart and the esophagus and trachea, and then the sternum if you want to include skeletal system, okay? But it's right in this center box, okay? A lot of people believe that the heart is over on the left-hand side. That's a common misconception because, and there is a little truth to it, and where that comes from is that if you can see, the majority of the heart actually does lie to the left of the midline of the sternum, okay, because of the positioning. But truly, the heart's really much more in the center. It's certainly not over under the left breast like many people seem to think, okay? The layout of the heart, okay? It's interesting that when you look, and remember, we're always referring to the patient's side, okay? So to the patient's left is where the apex of the heart is, this triangular tip of the heart, okay? Now, sometimes this confuses students, so just remember this and make yourself aware. This is called the apex of the heart, okay, this triangular point, because an apex can be a V-shaped, in a building, an apex is a triangular area at the top of a building, okay? The base of the heart, and this is what sometimes confuses students, the base is this part up here that's much more flat. So the heart apex and base are named more after their shape than where they are orientation-wise, location-wise in the body. The base is actually here at the top, and the apex is down here at the bottom, okay? So don't get confused by that. This is the base because it's wide and flat, but it's the top, and the apex is pointy, and it's down here at the bottom. All right, so the apex always points over to the patient's left. And like I told my lab group yesterday, whenever, and this is a hint for those of you guys that don't have me for lab, which is everyone that didn't have me yesterday, when you're looking at your lab quiz and you're asked to identify something on the heart, and you will be, like the sulcus or the vessels, okay? Always look first for the orientation of the heart. What are you looking at? If you're looking at the anterior of the heart, the apex of the heart is going to be pointing to the patient's left, to your right, okay? If you're looking at an image, and you will be on the lab quiz, I promise, where the heart is pointing, the apex is over here pointing this way, you now know you're looking at the posterior of the heart. And that's really critical when you're identifying features on the surface of the heart for your lab quiz, because otherwise the anterior and posterior, as far as vasculature and the sulci, look a lot alike. So just, I'm trying to give you a word to the wise, a hint, some caution. Always look first for which way that apex is pointing, and that will guide you as to whether you're looking at the anterior or the posterior of the heart, and that in turn will guide your answer. All right, so true to a lot of wives' tales and common belief, the heart is approximately the size of a fist. Again, this is largely dependent on the size of the person. If you weigh 350 pounds, your heart is a lot larger than the size of a fist. It might be the size of 3 fists. If you weigh 80 pounds, it might be slightly smaller than your fist. Okay, so it varies. It's around a pound, but again, that's going to vary. Again, located in the mediastinum, and I talked about this while illustrating it because that's always advantageous. I think it's easier to absorb. Remember, that base is the flat top surface, and the apex is the pointy surface that when you're looking from the front at the anterior, points to the patient's left. All right, this slide, I promised that we were going to look at the layers of the heart, of its structural composition. And this slide is underlined and highlighted, so you guys probably know already what that means. This is going to be one of your matching questions on exam number 2, okay? So know the layers. You just have to know the layers of the heart, okay? All right, so let's start first, before we get into the 3 layers of the heart itself. Let's go back and have a refresh to Bio 210 when we talked about tissue types and we talked about serous membranes. And remember, we talked about the pericardium, right? And we had a parietal layer, and then deeper to that, a visceral layer, and it had serous membrane fluid in the middle, which the serous membranes encapsulate, and protect the heart, the lungs, and all of our digestive and abdominal organs, right? And the serous membranes are there to reduce friction and to cushion and protect these vital organs, okay? Well, the pericardium, the parietal layer, is the outermost. So we're going to start with that in a minute. But first, we're going to add one new layer here. First, on the very, very, very surface is a paper-thin layer that you can't even really see if you're looking even at a dissection. And it's called the fibrous pericardium, okay? And this is, just like the name says, it's fibrotic tissue that is just there as an outer casing of the heart. It's there just to kind of hold together and be an extra layer of protection, okay? It's like a shrink wrap on something that comes, a package from Amazon, okay? All right, once we get under the fibrous pericardium, then we get into the serous membrane, and then this should be a refresh. We have the parietal pericardium, and then underneath it, we have that space that's open, that's filled with serous fluid called the pericardial cavity. And then we have the visceral layer of the pericardium, the deepest layer that is, as we taught back in 210, the surface of the organ. So that's why the visceral pericardium also is called the epicardium, one of the 3 layers of the heart, okay? So one more time, you have the fibrous pericardium, protective coating, outer layer. Then we have the serous membrane, the parietal layer, and then the visceral layer. And that visceral layer is also the most superficial, the outermost layer of the 3 layers of the heart wall, also called, so it's the visceral pericardium, also called the epicardium. Then underneath that, as we go deeper, is that muscular wall that I said is the thickest by far, as you can see, the muscle, the true workhorse, the functional unit of the heart, called the myocardium. And then the innermost layer of the heart is called the endocardium. And this is just smooth tissue to prevent anything from sticking or clotting to it. Okay, so the 3 layers proper of the heart are the endocardium, deepest, myocardium, thickest, middle muscle, and then the epicardium, the surface. Epicardium is also the visceral serous membrane, and then we have the serous gap, the cavity, parietal, and then a fibrous pericardium. All right, so this all just says exactly what I just talked about. So we're not going to go over it all again because I literally just told you all of this while we were looking at this slide. Just know that you're familiar with these layers. They're not difficult. Again, this should all be a refresh, and there's only 3 layers here. So easy matching questions if you just study. All right. Then we're back to continuing. These are the 3 layers of the layers of the pericardium, a 210 refresh, if you will. And then here are the 3 layers of the heart, the epicardium, the myocardium, and endocardium that we just talked about again. So don't need to talk about that again. We already went through it. So here, for the first time, we have a cutaway looking internally at the heart itself. Okay, so we see our 4 chambers. Our right atrium, receiver of deoxygenated blood. Right ventricle, from the atria, blood deoxygenated flows down into the right ventricle. Okay, the left atrium over here that's receiving oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. And then, of course, when the left atrium contracts, it's going to eject blood downward into the left ventricle, which is going to, when it contracts, expel blood out systemically. Okay, 4 chambers, 2 atria left and right, 2 ventricles left and right. Separated by, all right, some new stuff here. Okay, septum are going to be the terms, the dividing tissue that divide the right and left heart. Okay, here we see our interventricular septum, large muscular myocardial muscle tissue that is, just like the name says, interventricular in the middle of the 2 ventricles. And it's a septum like our nasal septum divides our left and right nostril. The interventricular septum divides the right and left ventricle. Now, up here we have, and this illustration doesn't show it, but trust there is one, it's just running right behind this pulmonary trunk, there's an atrial septum also that divides the right and left atrium, but it's much thinner. As you can see, very thin muscular wall of the atrium compared to the left ventricle, which is the workhorse, the thickest muscle by far. And then the right ventricle is kind of middle of the road. Okay, much more muscular than the atria above them because they have further to pump. They have to move blood all the way to the lungs, but not as muscular as the left ventricle because they don't have to pump it through the whole body. All right, so let's talk here about the valves for a second and what happens with the contractions. And remember, the first thing to always remember about contractions of the heart is that they're synchronized. The right and left atria contract, squeeze, eject blood at the same time as one another. Then they rest, and then it's the ventricles' turn. The right and left ventricles at the same time squeeze, contract, ejecting their blood. And then it's the atria's turn again. Okay, so they alternate, but remember that they're synchronized because that's really important. All right, so when that blood from either of the atria, it doesn't matter, when the atria contract, the valves, there are 4 valves in the heart, okay, and the valves act like traffic cops. They direct blood. They open the gate to let things through, and then they close the gate to keep things from going back through and steer it in a different direction. Okay, so they're really regulating and directing traffic, if you will. When the atria contract, what we call are because of the name, atrioventricular valves, these 2 valves in white on the right and left side. Atrioventricular, meaning connecting the atrium to the ventricles below. Okay, those are the type of valves. Specifically, on the right-hand side, it's called the tricuspid valve. And when we talk about valves, we talk about leafs. You can kind of see it better over here on the left. Here's one leaf of tissue, and here's one leaf of tissue. You can see it a little bit here on the right. You can see one leaf and one leaf, but we can't see the third. Okay, leaves are also called cusps. Okay, these are folds or flaps that, like a parachute, will seal off the opening, what the valve in fact is. Okay, So the right ventricle and the right atria are divided by the tricuspid valve, having 3 leaves. Between the left atrium and the left ventricle is a bicuspid valve that only has 2 leaves. On the right-hand side, it's only called the tricuspid valve. On the left-hand side, it is called the bicuspid or mitral valve. 2 completely accurate and fair names, okay? All right, so when they contract, these valves are going to, when the atria are ready to contract, these valves are going to get pulled open to facilitate that blood being ejected from the atrium on both right and left side down into the ventricles. Okay, that's what we want to achieve. Okay, what's going to pull these valves, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, open? So first of all, we can see down here into the tissue, onto the myocardial inner lining of the ventricles. We can see these little finger-like projections that look a little bit like baby carrots, if you will, okay? And they're called papillary muscles. The word papilla in Latin means projection, okay? You might remember it back to the epidermis, okay? In the integumentary system, there were papilla. There was a papillary layer of the dermis, okay? Finger-like projections. So these muscular projections that come off of the inner lining of the ventricles are called papillary muscles, and they attach in turn to tendons. They're little string-like tendons, cord-like tendons called, not coincidentally, chordae tendineae, tendon-like cords. And they, in turn, attach to each of the leaves, the chordae tendineae do, to each of the leaves of the valve. So when it's time for these atrioventricular valves to open, when the atrium are about to contract and we want to steer blood downward and receive it, these papillary muscles will contract, pull on the chordae tendineae, they'll pull on the leaves and pull these valves open. That allows blood to come in this way. Now, the other 2 valves in the heart are called by type semilunar valves, okay? And there's one here and there's one here. It's a little bit hidden, but you can see it, okay? Now, fortunately, these valves, when the atrioventricular valves are opening, these valves are going to shut because we only want blood to come this far and this far. We want it to collect and then stop for a second, and then we're going to switch turns. At this point, the atrioventricular valves are going to shut, sealing it off so blood can't go backward into the atria when the right and left ventricle contract. Instead, these semilunar valves are going to open, and when the right ventricle contracts, the blood is going to go through this open pulmonary valve, which is the specific name of this semilunar type valve, into the pulmonary trunk, and then the pulmonary arteries on the right and left side going to the lungs. And then when the oxygenated blood comes back, remember I said there are 2 pulmonary arteries, 1 right and 1 left, and 4 pulmonary veins, 2 left and 2 right. The oxygenated blood coming back from the lungs is going to come back to the left atrium and then down through this bicuspid or mitral valve. And then when the ventricles contract, ejected into the aorta to leave for the system through the aortic valve. So the anatomists did everyone a favor in naming these valves in the same name as the vessel that the blood is flowing to. The pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, and the aortic valve when the blood's heading into the aorta. Okay? A lot of stuff. You're going to hear that again in lab. You're also going to hear it more as we proceed. Now, a lot of this we just covered. Again, I like to talk and explain and lecture when we can see a picture. We've talked about the 2 atrium, right and left, the 2 atria, plural, the 2 ventricles. We talked about the interventricular septum and the atrial septum that separates the atria. All right, we talked about the receiving chambers of the heart, the right atrium collecting that deoxygenated blood from the body, and the left atrium being the collecting chamber of the heart for oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. Then we talked about the two ventricles, which are the pumps of the heart, essentially. The right ventricle that sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle, which sends oxygenated blood out to the body and to the heart. Okay, so we've been through this before. All right, on the anterior surface, here for the first time, we can see our coronary arteries and coronary veins. The arteries are drawn in red because they're oxygen rich. We're going to talk a lot more about these when we talk about cardiac vessels. 2 lectures from now, here we can see the atrium, the atria, right and left, okay? And you'll notice when we look at the heart at a true anterior, if you truly cut a patient's chest open, you're going to see a lot more of the right side of the heart because the heart is rotated a little bit. The left ventricle, you can only see from a true anterior view a lot less of a percentage of it than the right ventricle, okay? The heart is kind of rotated backward into the chest cavity. All right, and then here's a posterior, and remember I said orientation is everything. Apex pointing to the left, we know we're looking at the anterior. Apex pointing to the right, we know we're now at the posterior. All I really want to show you here for the purposes of lecture is this is that coronary sinus that I told you is the collection point for deoxygenated blood coming back from the myocardial gas exchange. Coronary arteries bringing oxygen-rich blood to the myocardial muscle, coronary veins returning deoxygenated blood ultimately to this large collecting vessel vein called the coronary sinus, which in turn dumps into the right atrium like the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. 3 points of entry for deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium that I mentioned previously. We'll talk more about the coronary sinus and all these vessels when we talk about vein vessels. All right, auricles, want to mention them briefly to you. Auricles are little extra appendages. They're extra seating capacity, okay? They're little flaps, pouches that attach to the atrium. And here we can see one, this is the left atrium proper, and on top here is this little extra sac. During the majority of our daily activity, blood flowing back to the body into the right atrium and from the lungs into the left atrium. The atrium themselves, the atria themselves can accommodate that blood volume. But in times of extreme stress or work, if you're exercising, for example, okay, there's increased blood flow, and we're going to talk about that more next time when we talk about cardiac physiology and cardiac output. But there's increased flow because there's increased demand for oxygen as our muscles work harder. Okay, when there's increased flow, there's going to be increased return of blood to the heart from both the body and from the lungs. There's more blood pumping. Okay, so in that case, the volume of blood coming back to these atria, which are rather small, in particular compared to the ventricles, sometimes exceeds capacity. And then that's when these auricles, these extra pouches attached to each atrium, they come into play. They're just, like I said, extra capacity for times of high demand. That's what the auricles are, okay? The other thing we want to talk about are the sulci, and just like with the brains, a sulcus or a sulci plural are physical indentations, grooves in the surface of an organ. You probably remember them back to talking about the brain in Bio 210, okay? With the heart, there's the coronary sulcus, and usually on these sulci are where our coronary arteries, along with fat deposits, are going to tend to accumulate. The coronary arteries are going to tend to embed themselves in these naturally occurring grooves on the surface of the heart, okay? So we have the coronary sulcus, which is right here and right here. That separates the atrium from the ventricles on both sides. It's the indentation, the physical divide, okay? And then we have the anterior interventricular sulcus, front side, anterior, interventricular, just like the interventricular septum was inside dividing the right and left ventricle. This interventricular sulcus, this groove, marks where that division would be on the surface of the heart. Okay, so we have the coronary sulcus, or also sometimes called atrioventricular sulcus. Either one's fine. And that's on both the right and left side. And then we have the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then we have a posterior interventricular sulcus that does the exact same thing, but on the posterior of the heart. Okay, so those are the sulci of the heart and auricles, what they're all about. Okay, all right, so we've talked all about this already. Okay, we've talked about the atria being the receiving chambers, and that the right atrium collects deoxygenated blood from the body and from the heart. The atrium has what's called the myocardial, the inner lining is lined with what are called pectinate muscles, whereas inside of the ventricles, the muscles that kind of look like squash or spaghetti in here are called trabeculae carneae. You'll learn more about that in lab. Okay, the inner linings of the atria are called pectinate muscles. You'll need to know that for your lab quiz. And the inner lining of the ventricles, the muscles, are called trabeculae carneae. Okay, two different terms, inner lining, muscle walls of the ventricles and atria, respectively. All right, so again, we've talked about this, the three veins that bring deoxygenated blood to the right atrium, superior and inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus from the heart. Know for the exam that the left atrium is that receiving chamber that receives oxygenated blood returning from the lungs, and that there are four pulmonary veins, which we're going to talk about more when we talk about cardiac vessels, two from the right lung, two from the left. And then your second and final extra credit question for today: which chamber of the heart receives deoxygenated blood, not only from the body, but from the heart? Deoxygenated. All right? All right. And we've seen this illustration before. Continuing just a recap of what we've already talked about. The ventricles are the true pumpers. These are the discharging chambers. Like it says, this makes up the vast majority. The atria are very small by comparison, especially if not inflated. They lay flat-like on the surface. The ventricles are the vast majority of the size and mass of the heart. Again, you're going to see a lot more of the right ventricle if you look at the anterior of the heart as it sits in the chest cavity, and the left ventricle is more posterior. We talked about the trabeculae carneae being the interior ridges and muscles of the ventricles, whereas the papillary muscles are attached to the inner ventricle wall and attach themselves to chordae tendineae, those cords that attach to the heart valves that pull them open and allow them to shut. Okay? We know that the right ventricle, and important for you to remember for the test, pumps that oxygen-poor, depleted blood into the pulmonary trunk headed toward the lungs. The left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood into the aorta. And know, like I've mentioned many times, and you'll hear many more times before we're done talking about the heart and the cardiovascular system, that the left ventricle wall, the myocardial muscle mass, is much thicker because it has to pump blood with more pressure to move blood throughout the entire body. Kind of common sense-ish. The valves we've already talked about, the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid with three leaves on the right, the bicuspid or mitral on the right, on the left rather, the two types of semilunar valves named appropriately as the pulmonary and the aortic. We've talked about these already. Know that the atrioventricular valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, prevent backflow into the atria when the ventricles contract. Again, if these valves that separate the atria and the ventricles didn't slam shut, when these powerful workhorse ventricles slammed shut, a lot of the blood would go back up through the opening, the wrong direction. And in cardiology, that's a common misfortunate situation, a diminishment of cardiac function because if a portion of your oxygenated blood is going back into the left atria, it's not getting out to the body. And the patient will have episodes of fainting or feeling lightheaded or confusion, dizziness, tired, lack of oxygen. Okay. And if blood that's supposed to be headed to gain oxygen from the right ventricle to the lungs instead goes backward, you're going to have a loss of oxygen loading capacity. So these are things that lead to other symptoms and disease processes. All right. So just know that those atrioventricular valves are there to prevent backflow. When the ventricles contract, like I said, they're traffic cops. They seal shut so the blood can only go one way through the open semilunar valves. All right, then we already just talked about the semilunar valves, but yet another illustration of the aortic into the aorta from the left ventricle and the pulmonary into the pulmonary trunk, which immediately bifurcates into the right and left pulmonary artery, going to the right and left lung. Pulmonary, aortic. And that's it for today, guys. So that is it. For those of you watching this on Zoom, my Thursday sections, don't forget to email me your extra credit. For those of you today on Wednesday, thank you for allowing us to record this so I can share this with my sections on Thursday since I'm going to be out. Don't forget, do as you always do, and just send me your recordings or your answers right after the end of class here, and I'll let you guys know that you earned your extra credit. Okay? So, all right. Any questions before I cut you guys loose? That was a lot of content.